Human activity is affecting the climate. There is no doubt, no reasonable doubt that the link between carbon emissions and global warming has been established. The natural cycles of climate variability don't account for the most recent 3 years, showing continued record-setting months for high temperatures. Yet, the will of our governments and businesses to take action to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and methane into the air seems to be frozen, inaction favored because of the power of denialism. The effects of warming have been devastating. There are increased floods and storms. As this podcast is being produced, the very wild storm, Hurricane Matthew, is hammering the Atlantic coast of the United States after having battered Hispaniola in Cuba and the Bahamas. The weird nature of this storm, the manner in which warm water at depth fueled its growth and strength, is an example of how climate change is affecting our environment and placing humans in danger and leading to the loss of life. Dr. Michael E. Mann and Tom Tolles have co-authored a new book, an illustrated nonfiction book explaining human-caused global warming and examining the political denialism that is delaying action. Michael Mann is Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State University and a leader in the push for an understanding of the science and the effects of climate change. He shared a Nobel Prize with his fellow members on the International Panel on Climate Change and has authored and co-authored several papers on climate science and global warming. I am Mike Hobbrick, and along with Greg Layden, I welcome you to this episode number 10 of Ikonokast, with our guest, Michael Mann.
Mike, a lot of people who read my blog probably know this, but not everyone, that whenever I encounter a really important scientific finding in climate change research, I usually run it by you to find out what you think about it, because you're like the world's leading expert, and I have your email address. And I appreciate that, because it really helps me to focus on getting things right, because it often isn't easy to do that. I want to take a little time later in this interview to do something that's just what I like to do. The reason why I like to do interviews like this is to actually get into some of the hardcore science in a way that usually doesn't happen. Yeah. I remember interviewing a famous scientist a few years ago, and I decided to listen to, it was my first interview of a famous scientist, and I listened to several other interviews done of him. And every single one was exactly the same, and absolutely none of them were even slightly interesting. And since his research area was in space magnetic plasmas, that's what I asked him about. And he gave us an hour of really interesting stuff about magnetic plasmas. So I hope we can do that later. But first, I want to start off by...
I'd be happy to talk about magnetic plasmas later. If you like.
We can do that.
Excellent.
I want to start off by just asking you about your latest book. You have a brand new book out called The Madhouse Effect, and it's hot off the presses. And it's a little unusual because it's a cartoon book as well as text. It's not a cartoon book. People think they're going to get all cartoons. They're not. There's lots of text in it. Tell us about the book. What brought you together to co-author Tolles, and why did you write up this book? What's it about?
Thanks. Well, it's as I try to explain to people, I and many other of my colleagues, climate scientists, we've been trying to communicate the science to the public for years through graphs and equations and numbers, and we haven't really broken through with that. We've encountered some resistance, and so I've basically been reduced now to showing a sequence of cartoons. That's how I go about trying to explain the science. But seriously, it was a wonderful opportunity that sort of fell into my lap. I had actually corresponded with Tom Tolles, who your listeners may recognize the name. He's the Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist for the Washington Post, with those really cool square cartoons that has the little guy down in the corner always saying something interesting and important and pithy, and you have to read that fine print, and that's actually Tom himself down in the corner. And then it says Tolles in the other lower corner of the cartoon. And so these iconic cartoons, through these cartoons, Tom has been engaged in what I consider the hardest hitting commentary about climate change in our entire print media. There is no place aside from his cartoons on the editorial pages of the Washington Post where you will find in our mainstream media somebody really going right to the heart, the irony and the hypocrisy of modern-day climate change denial, a denial by our politicians, a denial by fossil fuel-funded, paid talking heads. So I had corresponded with him in the past because I used some of his cartoons in a previous book of mine, which is about my experiences in the center of the climate debate, the hockey stick and the climate wars. And through that correspondence, I developed a friendship with Tom, and we decided that the time was ripe to sort of combine forces. Both of us, in our own ways, have been doing everything we can to communicate the nature of the problem and the threat that it represents to the public, and that maybe by combining forces and, as we say in the book, combining the left brain driven approach of a scientist like myself with the right brain driven approach of an artist like Tom's, and maybe combining our right and left brain and approaching the problem in a different way, talking about the problem in a different way, maybe, we can break through to some people who have otherwise been resistant to the message that the science has for us, the implications of the science. There's something about, and we know this today, we often find the most blunt, the most direct social commentary in coming from comedians, Stephen Colbert and John Oliver, and somehow the hardest hitting social commentary comes from comedians. Why is that? I think it's because we tend to drop our defenses to some extent when we encounter a topic that has been presented in the framework of humor and satire. And that means that, maybe there's a way to reach people by framing this topic, which isn't funny. There's nothing funny about the fact that we are literally threatening the future survival, future prosperity of the human species through the changes in climate that we're creating by burning fossil fuels. There's nothing funny about that. Maybe there's a sort of gallows humor to it. But if we can find a way to have a sense of humor while at the same time using that sense of humor to really cut right to the center of the problem and the hypocrisy of climate change denial, and move beyond that in the discussion to the forward-looking discussion about what to do about the problem. Maybe a way of doing that, thinking about the problem, presenting it in a different way. And I'm always open to different ways about trying to break through this barrier that we've had when it comes to communicating the true nature of this threat to the public and to our policymakers.
I'm reminded of several years ago, I was visiting my sister out in California, and her husband, Glenn, we were talking about something in the news, and I was complaining about the news media, and he said, "We don't watch the news anymore." And I said, the news is important. You have to watch it. I said, "Oh, the news is important, but we get all our news from Comedy Central."
Wasn't there a study that, like most millennials, maybe this was about, 10 years ago or so, that the vast majority of millennials actually got their news from Jon Stewart.
Right,
and
exactly.
The Comedy Channel. Yeah.
And I thought this was a bit crazy. By the way, they're older; they're not millennials. But I thought it was a bit crazy, and I thought he wasn't serious. And then 6 months later, I never have cable, but I watched some, and I realized, oh yeah, this is actually better. Yeah. I think there's a couple of reasons besides what you mentioned. I think it's also true that they have one criterion by which they keep their jobs, and that is to be funny.
Right.
They don't have criteria about how to give a balanced story and to include the perspectives of the people who think Bigfoot is real or that climate change is not. But they're not required to do the things that the media seems to feel is required to do, and so doing usually does a fairly bad job. And they can be honest and straightforward and kind of spectacular in how they say it. And of course, as you say, the other thing is, I never met a comedian who wasn't actually very, very smart.
Comedy is about seeing, in my view, in seeing through to the simple truths that often evade us, and there's something funny often about having truths revealed to you in a way that it's getting you to think about something in a different way, and often that process involves humor, and it involves satire and ridicule and the exposure of hypocrisy. I mean, all these things are related.
Yeah. That you're talking now about your co-author's contribution to the book, mostly the cartoons. What about your contribution? What I'll say about it quickly is that I have seen your writings from the hockey stick wars and through many commentaries.
Yeah.
in newspapers, the Washington Post, and various places, and I've heard you speak a lot. I'll just say, as a person who also, I teach and I give public talks, you get a topic and you learn how to explain it, and then you talk to the people after you're done and you realize that you screwed up something, and then you do it better and you do it better and you do it better until finally you've got it down. And so you were good before, but you're much better now even. I mean, the way that you can describe the basics of climate change, you've been perfecting this for a long time now. And what I found is that the text in this book is actually really the best and most current and best put, depending on what topic you're talking about, descriptions of either the climate change itself or the nature of denialism. And you talk about denialism quite a bit and how that works in the politics of climate change. How do you feel about that work that you did? I think it's pretty good. I mean, what was the main messages you're trying to get across?
Yeah, thanks. And, I guess when you keep at something for long enough, and, I used to like to think of myself as a young academic, and I'm no longer a young academic. I've been at this for a few decades now, and you learn, hopefully, we learn from our mistakes. You learn what works and what doesn't work, and you refine your approach, and you watch other people, and you figure out what it is in what they do effective, and sometimes you try that on, and sometimes it doesn't fit, right? So it's a combination of figuring out what works, what approaches to communication are effective, and then which of those approaches fits naturally with you, with your approach, with your personality. And so I think it takes a while. That process, it takes a while, and I like to think that, some of the great communicators, science communicators, Carl Sagan, Stephen Jay Gould, Neil deGrasse Tyson, sort of in the when I was growing up, and folks who are doing this today, I'd add my friend Bill Nye to that legion. I like to think that they have improved over time as well. They've figured out what works and what doesn't. And so it's a process. Now with this particular project, with working with Tom, what I find so amazing is about his cartoons, and you guys probably recognize this yourself in having seen his cartoons over the years, packed with there's so much going on. There are multiple messages. There are often multiple levels of meaning and interpretation. There's just so much going on in that cartoon. And so the challenge for me was to try to unpack those cartoons. And what we found was that a few of those, unpacking just a few of Tom's cartoons gives you a chapter, more or less. So that was the process. Figuring out, the process was first to start out with an idea of what territory we wanted to cover. And as you know, we wanted to talk about sort of just the basic, philosophy of science, and what is skepticism, what's true skepticism, how does that contrast with climate change denialism. We wanted to start out with a discussion of, how science works, and then get on to the specifics of the science of climate change, and talk about the impacts and the reasons we should care, and then get into why there is a climate change denial movement, where it comes from, what form it takes, why it is so misguided, who are the actors, and we do call out, we name names. We call out the bad actors because we think it's important. I think you have to pay a price for trying to mislead the public and policymakers about what might be the greatest threat we've faced as a species. And so we weren't afraid to call out the bad actors. And ultimately, we do end, as on a cautiously optimistic note, because there are genuinely, and Greg, and I talk about this a lot. We are part of a group of communicators that talk about what is the status of, solving climate change. Where are we in this battle? And it turns out, if you follow it pretty closely, there are actually some reasons for cautious optimism, despite a lot of the bad things that we're already seeing happen because we didn't act, decades ago when we should have. There's still time to avert the worst impacts, and we're starting to turn the corner. And these are all things we can, of course, talk about later on in the interview. But we wanted to sort of cover all that ground, and it turned out that Tom's cartoons formed a natural template for doing that. There were some gaps, and so basically we started with the cartoons that Tom has done over the years, and they're pretty wide-ranging. And then we figured out where the gaps were, and Tom did a number of original cartoons for the book that allowed us to, tell the whole story through cartoons and through text, which is pretty light, and we keep the text sort of, it's almost conversational, and the main role of the text is to unpack the really potent messages that are told through the cartoons.
It's done very, very well. It's really, I recommend the book to people. People should pick it up. We'll have a link to it right on the site.
Thanks.
And it's different than other books in a good way. It's also, by the way, to pick up for the holidays to give to your Uncle Bob. The guy who's always talking about
Bob. Yes.
Right. Everyone has an Uncle Bob somewhere. And I think this is definitely, speaking of which, not Uncle Bob, but what you mentioned a moment ago about turning the corner. Do you think the Paris Accords enacted right now are going to slow the acceleration of global warming? Just today, the news came through that the European Union voted to ratify the Paris Agreement. And that's good news. I think I don't know how much more ratification is needed, but it's really going along far. Is it going to be what we need to do? Is it enough?
Yeah, and President Obama said that we're just weeks away from the U.S. ratifying as well. We talk about, of course, the Paris summit in the book. In fact, what's so interesting, you can imagine, the time frame of the book is that we started it, about a year ago. So all of this stuff has been unfolding as we've been writing and revising the book, and it's been a moving target. Some of the late changes that we made in the book had to do with the significant recent developments like the Paris summit last December, and of course the evolving playing field of the current U.S. election, which we literally had to revise the book even after the final galleys were sent out for review to media outlets, and because the story has been changing, and even within the last week or two. There's been another chapter in the ongoing saga of Donald Trump and his denial of climate change. It's sort of hard to keep up with all of that. So that was a real challenge. But with Paris, getting back to actually the specifics of your question, it was a monumental achievement. And it won't solve the problem. The commitments that were made in Paris are not enough to keep warming below most scientists are willing to say constitutes truly dangerous interference with the climate, warming of more than 2 degrees Celsius or 3.5 Fahrenheit relative to the pre-industrial. The commitments that were made in Paris won't get us there, but they actually get us halfway from where we would have been heading under business as usual, which would have been a 7 to 9 Fahrenheit warming of the globe by the end of the century. They get us halfway to keeping warming below that dangerous 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degree Fahrenheit limit. So if you're looking for reasons for, again, cautious optimism, you look at that and you say, well, we didn't solve the problem, but if we can get, the nations of the world to make good on the commitments that they made in Paris, then it means we're turning the corner and we're on a different path, and we're on a path that doesn't quite take us to where we need to get. We will need to improve upon the commitments that were made in Paris, and it's possible though to imagine that such a path now exists, where a few years from now, in the next conference of the parties, the nations of the world will make even more stringent commitments. And, possible now to see a path toward stabilizing warming below truly dangerous, potentially, irreversible levels of climate change. But there's a lot of work that remains to be done. So we shouldn't rest on our laurels, but we shouldn't throw up our hands in defeat, because there is reason for cautious optimism.
So it sounds like we've kind of come through or overcome like a psychological barrier with that announcement today.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly right. The barriers to solving this problem are not physical. They're not in the physics of radiative balance and the greenhouse effect. The physics still allows for us to solve the problem. The only barrier right now is mustering the will to do what's necessary. And, it is framed this as a mobilization akin to what we did in World War II. It's going to require a major mobilization and full partnership between government and the private sector, like we had, in World War II. It's going to require that level of effort, that level of commitment, but it's doable.
Now, the first thing that made the mobilization of World War II possible was the Lend-Lease agreements that were made prior to the American citizenry getting on board with actually going to war in Europe or Japan and in Asia. And then, of course, what made the difference was Pearl Harbor. Otherwise, it would have been a much longer delay for the U.S. getting involved in that war. I think I can cite any studies right now that back up my sense of this, but I think that the weather matters a lot. Climate is the weather long term, and the weather is climate today. And for people to believe in climate change, the science itself isn't as convincing as a really, really hot summer might be, or a really devastating storm that happens to you, not to somebody else. One of the problems
we say that as Matthew is brewing.
Exactly. I want to talk about this for a second, if we could. Now, right now, it's Matthew, as we're speaking now, is sitting between. It just went over part of Haiti. It's got a weird feature affecting the Dominican Republic. It's about to hit Cuba. But by the time people are listening to this, because they may even take days to get around to listening to it, Matthew will be a story. So without predicting whether or not Matthew, unless you want to, whether or not Matthew is going to make landfall in the U.S. or how bad it's going to end up being, it is a unique and interesting storm that I would regard as almost qualitatively unique. Not unique, but different, like Katrina was, like Patricia was, like Haiyan. It has spun up very fast. It has very deep hot water fueling it. And it's got a few other features that are making it almost like a new kind of hurricane. But the Atlantic Ocean hasn't been producing dangerous, deadly storms that people get freaked out about and are affected by since now it's been 11 years, I think.
Right.
So I don't really have to drought. And by the way, for listeners should know that, every year various climate experts come out with the predictions of the Atlantic storm season, what it will be like. And Mike, you're one of the teams. Your team is one of the predicting teams that does that.
Yeah.
How is the Atlantic hurricane season doing this year so far, and is it going to give us any messages that will help?
So, we predicted more storms than any of the other groups. We predicted that there would be 19 plus or minus 5 named storms. Now, it turns out that the N storm has also formed now.
Right. Just today.
Just today. So we now have 14 named storms. At this, we still got a fair amount of the season left. It's still early October. We've got a solid month of potential high levels of activity. So our prediction of 19 plus or minus 5, we're already now within the error bars of our prediction. But I won't be surprised if it ends up being right in the center of our prediction of 19 named storms. It will be one of the most active seasons, and part of why our prediction method, one of the driving factors, there's El Nino, and part of the reason for the prediction of high levels of activity is that the El Nino event has subsided. We sort of started to go weekly into a La Nina event. It's not clear that we're really going to get a substantial La Nina, but we've sort of moved beyond El Nino conditions. That's favorable to Atlantic hurricane activity because it means that there's less wind shear in the Caribbean Ocean. And the main factor driving our predictions is the anomalous warmth in the tropical Atlantic, in the region of main development. And that's where we saw this storm take off. This storm went through a deep layer of warm water in the southern part of the Caribbean, right in the center of the region, the main region for development of tropical storms, the Atlantic. And as you already said, it was unique in at least since I've been watching the storms, I've been following Atlantic hurricane sort of activity for more than a decade now, pretty closely. And in the time that I have been following it, I've never seen a storm intensify as quickly as this did. First of all, from a tropical disturbance that wasn't even a tropical storm right into a hurricane within, less than half a day, and then ballooning into a Cat 5, healthy Cat 5 hurricane in yet another half day. It really underwent very rapid intensification. And one of the things that we do understand is that rapid intensification of storms is favored by very deep layers of warm water, like Haiyan had in the Pacific. We tend to see this sort of intensification most frequently in the Pacific, where storms are able to draw upon very deep layers of warm water. This storm almost looked like one of those Pacific storms in how quickly it developed. And it was aided by the same underlying factor that made Haiyan an unprecedented super typhoon. Just a very deep layer of anomalous, unprecedented warm ocean water.
Now, it seems to me that a very bad case scenario in the Atlantic could be the formation of a storm like this so quickly, but where the first thing it hits is, say, Miami. Because normally you get way more than a week notice that there might be a storm, and then you get a week's notice that there's a hurricane out there, and maybe it's going to come near you. Then you get 4 or 5 days of, it's going to hit you somewhere near you, and then you get solid 48 hours, and then usually at that point they're predicting to track it very accurately, even though you must always be cautious of that. But if the entire thing happens in 48 hours, if it goes from nothing to a Category 4 storm, it makes landfall in 48 hours, that's not enough time for people to actually people don't even know about it for the first 24 hours.
What's so sad here, of course, is that, people of Haiti, and this is a recurring theme, a lot of the worst impacts of climate change are actually going to be felt by those who are least able, the people who don't have the sort of financial resources and infrastructure that provides the sort of resilience that we have, say, here in an industrial nation like the U.S. We have a great amount of resilience, though even that was tested in, when it came to Katrina or Superstorm Sandy. But they have far less resilience, far less resources. The structures that they live in are far weaker, much more prone to damage from flooding and from wind. And that's the real tragedy, is that, Haiti is feeling the effects of a a Cat 5, strong Cat 4 hurricane. I'm not looking forward to the reports that we are going to be reading over the next 24 hours of just how much destruction and death likely resulted from the landfall of the storm. And it's not done, as we know. It continues to move through the Caribbean. It will likely now, at this point, it appears likely it will make a U.S. landfall. Not out of the question, it will make a landfall in southern Florida, maybe in Miami. We'll just have to see.
Yeah. Have you been following the discussion about the strange sort of mini substorm, the mini version of Matthew that's sitting in off to its right, that has been dumping many feet of water on DR, on the Dominican Republic?
Yeah, I've read some really nerdy. We can really geek out on this sort of stuff. We atmospheric scientists about features like this secondary area of deep convection and heavy rainfall with this storm that's so unusual. And I've been reading about various speculative arguments about how it may have to do with the effects of the topography of Hispaniola, that may have induced some rising motion that has introduced a unique sort of instability into this particular storm. So some of it might be coming from its interaction with topography, but it is an unusual storm. That is an unusual feature, and my guess is that the post-mortem on precisely what was involved. And in fact, that feature appeared, well before there was much interaction with topography. So that can't be all of it either. There's something going on with, there appears to be some sort of instability where there's a secondary area of subsidence and associated with it, an area of rising motion.
Well, okay. So on this question of the storm, we may have a more active than usual hurricane season this year. It looks like it's definitely more than average, and it's relatively high. Whether or not it's horrible to think that the only way people are going to be convinced that something has to be done is if a storm, no matter what it does in Haiti, no matter what it does in Jamaica or Cuba or the Bahamas, that as long as it hits Miami, that's good because it'll wake people up. But then, of course, you have even more destruction. On the other hand, I think we are seeing repeatedly bad weather news. It's finally starting to sink into the American psyche, and this year, the news that has also been getting, I think, enough attention, and it's dramatic enough, is the simple warmth. How warm this year is. We have had record-breaking months, so each month has been breaking records of the earlier versions of that month over time as anomalies. Right. How much of the current high temperatures we're seeing is residual, if any, from the El Nino we had last year?
Yeah, here in Pennsylvania, we're about a month late for the onset of fall. The leaves are only now just starting to turn, which is very unusual. We've had summer warm well into late September. We've only, within the last week or so, gotten our first fall-like weather, and that's not just true here and in the Northeast. To some extent, that's been true over a large part of the country. So what's interesting is that this year, the unusual global warmth, because the globe has been, 2014, 2015, and now 2016, all record-breaking years as far as global temperature is concerned. But somehow this year, we really felt the warmth here in the U.S. And as you allude to, it's unfortunate and but true that sometimes, when it comes to U.S., the world-leading nation as far as policy and culture is concerned, we set the tone for much of the larger global discourse. When we experience the impacts of climate change, that means that it has an unusual degree of leverage on the conversation. Because the U.S. has so much leverage on the larger conversation, when we here in the U.S. Feel the impacts of climate change, experience unprecedented extreme weather events that generate news and generate awareness among our population that something is happening, it really influences the larger dialogue worldwide. And I think we're seeing that this year. The fact that the U.S. has experienced such, just a horrific year of extreme weather, whether you want to talk about floods or droughts or wildfires or unprecedented hurricanes. The strongest, Patricia was the strongest hurricane on record that, struck the west coast of North America over the within the last year. We have just seen such an array of, it's almost like a rogues gallery, a who's who of all types of extreme weather events that we have long been predicting we would see more of because of climate change. And this year we've seen it all. We've had, by my count, at least a half dozen 1,000-year flooding events. We've been hearing this term a lot, 1,000-year event. Most people don't actually understand what it means, but it means this is an event that shouldn't happen any more often than once in 1,000 years. And yet, within the last year, we've seen a half dozen of these 1,000-year rainfall events in West Virginia, South Carolina, Louisiana, of course, Arizona, and on, and California continues to deal with what we now understand to be the worst drought it has experienced in at least a millennium. The point that I've been making, when people ask, why is the conversation changing? Why appear to be turning the corner on climate change denialism? And it's because people are seeing the impacts here in the U.S., are seeing the impacts of climate change with their own two eyes. And it's very hard for a climate change denying talking head to convince you that nothing is happening when you're feeling it and you're seeing it with your own two eyes. And I think that's what's happening now.
Right. Now, I would like to mention in terms of floods, by the way, I think we're under appreciating that. For example, Minnesota has not been mentioned in the news nationally or anywhere else. But we have had, over the last several weeks, just the other day, we had a 5.5 inch rainfall in 45 minutes, about a half a mile from my house. Here we only got 3 inches. That's not necessarily 1 in 1,000 years to have it in a small area, but my point is, having, for 2 years in a row, I think we've had something like double our normal rainfall in the state, and the crops are not coming in this fall because the fields are too wet, et cetera, et cetera. I think the floods get lost in the news cycles because there's just so many of them.
Well, that's right, and we talk about these, 1,000-year events, but the fact is that we're seeing record flooding over a large part of the country. It may not always be a 1,000-year flooding event, but what is true is the physics of atmospheric thermodynamics apply everywhere, and those simple thermodynamic principles tell us that as you warm the atmosphere, it can hold more moisture. And when the atmosphere can hold more moisture, what it that means that if conditions are conducive for rainfall, you're going to get more rainfall out of any given event. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing it writ large. We're seeing it in these 1,000-year rainfall events, but we're seeing it everywhere to a large extent.
And not only that, but it increases the kinetic energy, so the storms are going to be more intense as well.
Well, that's right, and there's a really interesting discussion to be had about the dynamics, for example, of tropical storms and hurricanes are different from the dynamics of mid-latitude cyclones. And to me, the most interesting of all storms are the nor'easters, because a nor'easter is sort of like a hybrid between a mid-latitude storm and a tropical storm. And there's some really interesting science looking at how climate change is likely to impact these nor'easters that have been giving us record snowfall in the winter in Boston, last winter in Washington, D.C., and climate change. Deniers like to point to that and say, oh, look, it's snowing in Washington, D.C., record snowfall. How can there be global warming? Well, actually, the record snowfall that we saw in Washington, D.C. related to the unusually warm ocean temperatures that existed off the coast that gave us a very strong temperature contrast, very strong nor'easter, and it was able to feed on all that warmth, meaning much more moisture in the air that was available to turn into record snowfall. So, in fact, those sorts of events are predicted to become more common because of climate change and global warming. And it may be that there will be a shorter period of the year where we have snow cover, but the individual snowfall events in coastal regions along the U.S. East Coast may actually become greater. We may see more of these super blizzards.
My understanding is that there's a certain amount of natural variation that happens in the surface temperature of the Earth. It goes up and down, and that up and down, like in El Nino, is very warm, and La Nina is a bit cooler. Yeah. And there's other large-scale oscillations which we expect to cause any graph you make of global surface temperatures to waver up and down over time. And some of that waving up and down lasts for decades. It goes up for decades and goes down for decades, up for decades. And so if we're in a period of time, this relates very much to what you're just talking about, because if we're in a period of time when there's a downswing in the natural background variation, global warming is not going to look as serious versus a time when it's an upswing when the global warming will be enhancing an already upward cycle in temperatures.
Right.
And this happens to be one of your main areas of research, right? And you have published a lot on this. Can you just give us a quick overview of what the long-term decadal oscillations that you have identified or looked at are, and maybe address a question like, where are we now in those oscillations and where are we going to be over the next 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, so this is actually what I did my PhD thesis research on. And when I came into the field of climate science from theoretical physics, my interests really had very little to do with climate change. Climate change as an issue was barely on my radar screen. I was interested in understanding the natural variability of the climate system. That was what fascinated me. And that includes things like El Nino. But El Nino is what we call an interannual phenomenon. It's sort of an oscillation, but the oscillation has a period of, a few years. It happens every few years. And there are these other longer-term oscillations that you allude to, and they have various names. I actually coined one of them, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, back in 2000, based on work that I had been doing and had been collaborating with other scientists and studying climate models and climate observations and trying to understand these natural cycles, and some of them last decades. And there's a natural cycle involving the climate of the North Atlantic that has to do with the North Atlantic Ocean circulation and the winds, pressure systems in the North Atlantic and how they all interact. And just like El Nino, that oscillation results from the way the tropical Pacific Ocean and atmosphere interact with each other. And it turns out that because of the way they interact with each other, you get this natural, unstable behavior that yields oscillations. Just like weather happens, whether you do anything to the atmosphere at all, oscillations that take days, which we call weather, happen just because of the internal physics of the atmosphere that makes that happen. You always have that variability. Well, the same thing is true with El Nino in the tropical Pacific. You always have that interannual variability. And it turns out that the Atlantic has its own version of that sort of cyclical variability, but its time scale is 30, 40, 50 years, and hence we termed it the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And then the Pacific has El Nino, and that's an interannual oscillation, but it turns out that some of the same dynamics of El Nino, when they start interacting with the North Pacific and the ocean gyres in the North Pacific, that introduces a longer time scale, and you get decadal oscillations in the Pacific. And there's a term, and that's called the Pacific decadal oscillation. So you have all of these oscillations, and they have different time scales, and they're centered in different regions. And with the longest of these oscillations, like the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation I was talking about, which is like a 40 to 60-year time scale, well, that is really what got me, my PhD research was very much focused on understanding that Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And the problem is, if you have a 60-year cycle and you have barely more than 60 years of instrumental observational data, we only have about a century of widespread thermometers and other instrumental climate data, it's sort of difficult to isolate that oscillation in the data. So guess what? It was our interest in the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation and isolating multi-decadal and century scale oscillations that led me to start analyzing so-called climate proxy data. During my PhD research, tree rings and ice cores and corals, natural archives that allow us to extend the record farther back in time, many centuries. So it was my interest in natural climate variability that led me to be interested in using these proxy data. Ultimately, when we started analyzing those proxy data, it led us to deduce that the warming trend that we had seen over the last century couldn't be explained in terms of natural oscillations. It was unprecedented. It had no counterpart as far back as we could go, 1,000 years. And that finding was sort of encapsulated in the so-called hockey stick curve that I published back in the late 1990s, which, of course, led me right into the center of the debate over human-caused climate change, because the hockey stick, that curve very clearly communicated the fact that there is something unprecedented about the warming that's taking place today, and probably has to do with, activity is the one thing that's unique about this period where we've seen this unprecedented warming spike. So it's a long about way of saying that it was my interest in studying natural cycles that led me to study climate proxy records that ultimately led me into the center of the debate over human-caused climate change.
See, isn't it interesting how science works?
It is. You follow, because, you follow where the data and the science leads you. And you don't, there's no preconceived notion, there's no agenda. You follow where the data takes you. And that's where it took us.
So where are we now in these cycles?
So right now, yes, getting back to your actual question.
Well, no, that was all very good.
The last, up through, I would say, about 2013 or so, sort of conventional wisdom, and we've published some work on this ourselves, suggests that we were sort of in the downturn of this natural Pacific decadal climate cycle, which is actually a period where there's natural cooling over a large part of the tropical Pacific, and the tropical Pacific is a pretty good chunk of real estate. The tropics, are roughly half of the surface area of the globe is between plus or minus 30 degrees. On a sphere, that's half the surface area. And the Pacific is the lion's share of the tropics. It's more than a third of the circumference. Earth is the Pacific. And so if you get a large amount of warming or cooling in the tropical Pacific, you're going to impact global temperatures. And this natural downturn in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or some people call it the Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation. There are many different names for it. But the bottom line is that the consensus is that we were sort of in the cooling phase of one of these natural cycles. And over the last couple of years now, it looks like we've come out of that. And here's the problem with those natural cycles, and you alluded to it earlier. You live by the natural cycle, you die by the natural cycle. It might have bought us a period of less warming than we otherwise would have expected, but now we're reaping what was sown. And now, as we appear to be seeing the flip side of that cycle, the warm side of that cycle, we are seeing, of course, unprecedented levels of global warmth, not just beating the global temperature record 3 consecutive years, which has never happened before. 2014, 2015, and 2016 will certainly now go down as the warmest year on record, and not just by a small margin. 2016 is going to be substantially warmer than the next warmest year, which is 2015. That can't all be explained by El Nino. Some of it might have to do with the positive. Now we're seeing the warming side of that natural Pacific cycle. Some of it may have to do with the fact that some of the natural cooling caused by things like volcanic activity has sort of subsided. And of course, we're continuing to add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and we would not be seeing record temperatures year after year as we're now seeing in the absence of human-caused climate change. In fact, we published an article in the journal Nature Scientific Reports earlier this year, showing that there is essentially less than a 1 in a million chance that we would be seeing the sequence of record-breaking temperatures we've seen globally over the last decade and a half, if not for the human impact of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations.
So we're going to be on an upswing possibly you probably can't ever say until after it's over, but we may be on an upswing of the major Pacific cycle for a few more years.
Yeah, in fact, another article we published earlier this year where we demonstrate that there may not be predictability in these cycles. Right. They may be what's known as red noise. The climate sort of wobbles around. These natural cycles wobble around, but you can never predict when a particular cycle is going to end or a new one to start. Yeah.
Right. Now, we don't have a lot of time left, but there's one other topic I was hoping to talk about, which you almost touched on earlier, but everyone wants to know about this because, well, I have a very specific question about it. The issue is the Atlantic conveyor. Now, we all know of the Atlantic conveyor because when it collapses, the British royal family is frozen to death in helicopters.
Right, and tornadoes will destroy Los Angeles. It's terrible. Yeah.
From that movie. A lot of things in that movie were wrong. I don't think that snowmobiles will go through the roof of a shopping center. I think they make them stronger.
No,
than that,
and there are no paleoclimatologists that are quite as handsome as Dennis Quaid. So let's just face that. Yeah.
Well, I think the first time I watched that, it was with some Ice Corps people, and I remember this guy saying, when the guy jumps across the crevice to save the Ice Corps, it's like you're standing on this giant glacier. You don't jump across the crevice to save the ice core. But anyway.
Well, let me say, you don't drill ice cores in the ice shelves.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, the point is there is this thing where, and I remember learning about this when I was in graduate school back when, this was first being figured out, and that basically a lot of heat, because of the distribution of continents and oceans, there's kind of some extra heat in the southern half of the planet, like the Indian Ocean, and that, a lot of weather on this planet is all about heat leaving the equator by air or by water somehow. Yep. And this sets up an unusual current that is a warm current that goes up the Atlantic and ends up dissipating in the North Atlantic, adding a lot of heat to the atmosphere, which is why Norway does not have so many glaciers on it. And, it basically warms up the northern continents a bit. And it's related, but not the same thing at all as the Gulf Stream. They're related issues, but not the same thing. And whether or not this thing is running is correlated over time, more or less, to whether or not there's an ice age going on. So when it's running, if you usually don't have an ice age, and when it's not running like it does now, that's usually when there is an ice age, although one is not necessarily causing the other. It's not a simple relationship, as I understand it. But that is the one part of this planet that is cooling down. That place that should be warm is getting cooler, and there's a concern that the Atlantic conveyor system may either shut down or move south or something. So, first of all, what is going on there? And second, what would be the effects of that shutting down?
It would be sort of a cruel joke, wouldn't it be? Wouldn't it, if you're in Iceland, and you can imagine Icelanders. Numerous friends live in Iceland. It's a wonderful country. I love the people there. I've been there a number of times over the last few years. You might not fault Icelanders wishing for a little bit of warming,
right?
Because it's pretty darn cold there. In the summer, there's summers. A warm summer day in Reykjavik is in the mid 40s Fahrenheit, or maybe close to 50 Fahrenheit. So you could understand how you might forgive them for thinking, well, maybe climate change wouldn't be so bad for us. What a cruel joke that the one area of the globe that might actually not warm or even cool slightly is the area in the North Atlantic that includes Iceland. And it is indeed due to, in the models predict this, and we published an article, my colleague Stefan Rahmstorff of the University of Potsdam, and a number of other collaborators, Jason Box, we published an article last year showing evidence that the conveyor belt ocean circulation is already slowing down. The models predict that it should slow down over the next century because of the warming effect. When melt ice, the fresh water runs into the North Atlantic Ocean. Fresh water is light relative to salty water, so that actually inhibits the sinking motion that helps drive this global conveyor belt. The models predict that the conveyor belt is likely to slow down, but the models say it should happen sometime over the next century. What we showed, based on a variety of observations, was that it's already happening. It's already been happening over the last century. And so it's just another example of a phenomenon where we appear to be seeing changes happening actually faster than the models suggest they should happen. And it does mean, if that ocean circulation pattern slows down, you won't get global cooling. You won't get another ice age. And so, very little, if anything that happens in the movie The Day After Tomorrow would actually happen. But the grain of truth to the movie is that you would see cooling in a region in the North Atlantic, and you would see less warming in certain parts of eastern North America, eastern Canada, Western Europe. That, and you might think, well, that would be a good thing, right? It might hold back some of global warming, at least for some places in the North Atlantic and neighboring the North Atlantic. But it turns out that it has all sorts of other implications, because that ocean circulation pattern actually helps sort of stir up the ocean. It is responsible it sets the stage for the convection, overturning, the sort of, what you might think of as sort of just the random mixing of the upper ocean. And that random mixing that happens in the upper ocean helps bring nutrients to the surface. And it's part of why the North Atlantic Ocean is one of the most productive regions as far as sea life is concerned in the entire world. And some of the most productive fisheries centered in the North Atlantic for that region. If that ocean circulation pattern were to collapse, we could actually see a substantial reduction of biological productivity in that critical region. And so at a time when climate change may be leading to greater competition for diminishing food and water and land of a growing global population, this could make the problem even worse by decreasing fish stocks and again, just adding insult to injury when it comes to the aggravating impacts of climate change on natural resources that we rely upon.
So it sounds like it'd be almost as dangerous as the continued leaching of some of the coral reefs that are in the Pacific in the same way as the way that it feeds the ocean, feeds the larger fish.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, here's the dirty secret. Coral reefs are not actually a region of tremendous ocean productivity. They happen in sort of the desert regions of the ocean. But they are, for that reason, they are regions of great biological diversity. So coral reefs give us much ocean biodiversity. But in terms of productivity, the most productive regions are the cold northern regions. Cold water holds more oxygen. More oxygen means that you can have more fish, and there's more energy available for organisms that rely on oxygen. So it turns out that much of the biological productivity in the world oceans is actually in the colder regions, and especially the North Atlantic for the reasons we were talking about. But you're absolutely right. At the same time, much of our biological biodiversity in the oceans is threatened from the demise of coral reefs. That is sort of a perfect storm of insults that can be attributed to us. It's the warming of the oceans and the bleaching of corals that's causing, where they lose their symbiotic organisms, algae that help them live. Then you've got ocean acidification from the CO2 that we're producing. It's building up in the atmosphere, but it's also penetrating into the ocean and acidifying the ocean. That is impacting coral reefs, and you've got pollution that's effluent that's running into the ocean, and so there are all these things that we're doing that are simultaneously threatening these unique ecosystems, and climate change is part of it.
Mike, we have to end pretty soon because we're nearly out of time, but I don't want to fail to mention your other two books, because this latest book is great, but you have two earlier books that I think people need to know about if they don't already. The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, what's going on right now in the battlefield. I'd be interested to know how much is different from the time you wrote the Hockey Stick, which was really that was in part a response to the email exposure and all of the attacks by the science denialists that happened at that time. And we're seeing this again right now with Lamar Smith and the Congressional so-called Science Subcommittee and so on. I don't think we have time to talk about this now, but I think what people really need to do is read that book because it is a very good description of this moment in time. Well, it's more than a moment in time, but really there is kind of a moment in time. I like to think of it as, imagine a history written just after the Battle of Gettysburg about the Civil War.
Right. Well,
it isn't the whole war. We're not done yet, but there's this moment in time when a lot of stuff has come together in a certain way.
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning that. And I did actually start writing the book. The book was mostly finished before the hacked emails of November, December 2009. And so I had to substantially revise the ending of the book and write several additional chapters because of the events that unfolded in the lead up to the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit, where climate change deniers and fossil fuel front groups and media organizations, right-wing media organizations, basically created this fake scandal, ClimateGate, where they stole thousands of scientists' emails and then intentionally misrepresented the content of those emails to try to make it sound like scientists had been fudging the data and climate change was indeed an elaborate hoax. And it was used to basically subvert the Copenhagen summit, to basically hijack the discussion and prevent any agreements from being made in Copenhagen to regulate carbon emissions. And the actors, the bad actors behind that fake campaign were fossil fuel interests that were, willing to do just about anything they could to prevent any action from being taken to require the regulation of carbon emissions and the incentivization of renewable energy. I like to think of it in retrospect. That event was sort of like it was sort of the Battle of the Bulge. It was a rear guard.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, it was a rear guard battle. The last gasp of climate change denialism, while fossil fuel interests and their advocates thought they might still be able to get away with it. And I think we've left that behind. I think the impacts of climate change have become so profound that it's very difficult to credibly deny climate change is happening. And we see that in the talking points used by Republicans who are still, funded by fossil fuel interests and are doing their bidding, and no longer say that climate change is a hoax, although Donald Trump did actually say that. But most of them will no longer try to get away with that. They'll say, well, I'm not a scientist, or, the science is uncertain, or, we don't know with 100% certainty, but they won't deny that something is happening. And I don't think that, I think climate change, unmitigated climate change denialism has become passé, and the in the book, in my new book, the Madhouse Effect, we talk about a kinder, gentler form of denialism, a more popular version of denialism which flourishes today, and people like Bjorn Lomborg or the so-called Breakthrough Institute are really very good examples of individuals and groups who now will say, well, okay, we accept the science. Climate change is real. It's at least partly caused by human activity, but, it won't be that bad. And the best way to deal with it is to just grow the economy, and we'll find ways to adapt, and we'll create ways of further manipulating Earth's climate, so-called geoengineering, so we can offset the effects of global warming by doing other things, by interfering in other ways with the global climate system. We'll just engineer our way out of this problem. That is a far more widespread type of denialism that exists today. And it's still denialism because it's denying that there's a problem that we need to attack by doing something about our ongoing burning of fossil fuels. But it has the veneer of credibility by appearing to at least accept the basic physical science. And I think that new, as I said, kinder, gentler form of denialism is equally, if not more dangerous, because it takes us to the same place. It still is used as an argument for not doing the necessary work of reducing our carbon emissions and transitioning to renewable energy, but it has this veneer of credibility that allows it to still be discussed in polite circles, and it's much more widespread among politicians who are still doing the bidding of fossil fuel interests today than outright climate change denialism. So I think you're right in that was a particularly unique point in time when I was finishing the book, 2010, 2011. It came out in 2012, where we were finally, I think, turning the corner in the battle against climate change denialism, but the battle isn't over yet.
I think that the section, by the way, in Madhouse on geoengineering is one of the more important things I've read recently on this issue, and I think everybody has to read that because that is right. That's the next denialism, is even beyond we'll adapt. I think the next level above that is geoengineering. That some major thing will come along and solve the problem. Somehow we'll reverse the basic physics of how carbon atoms interact, and not have to figure out a way of sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere without having to use energy somehow.
Right. And the subtitle of our chapter, of course, is "And What Could Possibly Go Wrong?"
Exactly. I just want to mention it quickly in closing to remind people of your other book, because you were one of the principal in different iterations of the IPCC report, which is the scientific statement on climate change as well as policy and so on, of the scientific basis of climate change policy and you shared with several other authors and scientists, and with the IPC itself, the Nobel Prize for that. And this is Nobel Prize season, so it's worth mentioning. But everybody can read the scientific basis volume from the IPCC report, or you could, stick a hot poker in your eye to get the same basic effect if you're not a scientist. Or you could read Dire Predictions, which is your other book, which is the IPCC report written for the average intelligent reader.
Yeah.
It's a book that I buy I pick up an extra copy of it every few months and give it to teachers.
Oh, wow, that's cool. Thank you.
Because that's what you have to do. As teachers, get into all fields now, because most teachers are now pretty concerned, and most teachers are now bringing climate change in all their classes. My wife does climate change in her biology classes.
Yep. It's in the new science standards, and
it's growing, and the teachers have to have a backup. They have to have the basic information.
Yep.
So this is enough to base an entire high school, for example, class on, but it's where you can get the basic information with, richly illustrated and great graphics.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, the Dire Predictions, it was a pleasure working with the folks at DK Publishing. It was a joint venture of DK and Pearson, so a traditional academic publisher, Pearson, but DK is known for their travel guides and children's books with, pictures of animals, and so they're really great about using vibrant graphics, and they really worked with us to find ways to bring the information sort of out of the page, and to really try to find a way to take what might otherwise seem like pretty dry material from the IPCC reports and bring it alive. And I'd like to take all the credit for it, but a lot of the credit goes to DK and Pearson for really working with us to find a way to make the science of the IPCC reports hopefully a lot more accessible.
And we'll include links from Amazon at Ikonokast.com. So if you're listening to this just on a regular podcast, make sure that you switch from your podcatcher over to Ikonokast.com and buy them through Ikonokast, because it does help support the podcast.
Thanks.
Right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Ikonokast with Michael E. Mann. Be sure to pick up a copy of his book from Amazon through the links at Ikonokast.com. And watch for the introduction of the Ikonokast channel at YouTube. Thank you again, and listen up and watch your podcaster soon. We'll have another episode of Ikonokast.